All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on telecommuting and workers' compensation. Today, we're going to be talking about what happens when you have an employee who's working at home and are they covered by workers' compensation. And we're also going to be talking about best practices for when you have an employee who is working at home, and that will end our presentation with some pointers for you on that. I'm Gage. I'm a legal manager at CopperPoint. I've been at CopperPoint since 2004. Before that, I was in private practice representing employers and insurance carriers and workers' compensation claims. I've been a certified specialist in workers' compensation since 1992. And Bobbie, she's going to introduce herself.
Good morning. Thanks for everybody for joining us. I'm Bobbie Fox. I'm the Vice President of Legal Compliance with CopperPoint Insurance Companies. I'm an in-house attorney, and my areas of expertise are, of course, compliance and commercial transactions and employment laws and human resources matters. So I've done a lot of speaking and writing on employment laws throughout the years.
All right, a little bit of housekeeping for you before we actually get started. If you hover your mouse either at the top or the bottom of your screen, you'll see some icons, and you'll see a question and answer icon. Please put your questions in there, and when we conclude our presentation, we'll get to those questions. But go ahead and put them in there as you think of them. And then if there is a chat icon, I'm not sure there is one, but if there is one, we ask that you please not put anything in the chat. Just put it in the question and answer. All right, so this is a little bit of a then and now picture. Pre-COVID, it was estimated that we had 5 million people in the US workforce who were working from home. And then it's estimated by 2021 that we're going to have 25 to 30% of the US workforce who'll be working at home at least part of the time. So as you can see, that's a significant increase in employees who are working from home, who are telecommuting. Pre-COVID, the typical telecommuter was college educated, a little bit older, a little bit higher salary than average, and working for large employers. And the professions that usually you would see telecommuting employees included the professional, technical, IT or information, finance, and insurance. And as you can imagine, that has increased significantly with COVID. Probably anyone who is sitting at home working in front of a computer or on the phone, they're able to telecommute. And I know personally, most law firms that I'm dealing with, they're telecommuting now. I have 2 adult sons who are in the IT world. They're both working remotely. So it really has expanded the telecommuting opportunities. So the question is, when does working from home and you have an injury, when does the home become a work premises for workers' compensation purposes? I will just tell you that pretty much any time that you're working from home, you're in a situation where workers' compensation could apply. But some of the questions that you could potentially be looking at are how often and with what regularity are you working from home? What kind of equipment do you have at home that you're using? I mean, how regularly is it there? And is there a special benefit to the employer for working at home? And I would suggest that in these times that it's certainly a benefit for the employer to be able to allow their employees to work safely from home. So when is an injury that's sustained at home covered by workers' compensation? You would do the same analysis for an at-home employee as you would for an employee working in their traditional work area. So did the injury arise out of and within the course and scope of employment? When you're looking at arise out of, you're looking at what was the employee doing at the time of the injury? Were they working? When you look at the course and scope, When did it happen? Where did it happen? What were the circumstances of the accident? So you're really doing the same analysis for an employee who's working at home as you would be doing for an employee who's working in the traditional workplace. And as with an employee who's in the traditional workplace, it is a no-fault system. So you have to remember that we're not assessing fault when we look at workers' compensation. So if an employee is injured at home while performing work in a place and at a time they are expected to be while working, an injury will be covered by workers' compensation. Again, same as a traditional workplace. And so for example, if an employee is expected to be working 8 to 5 in a home environment, they have an injury, 10 o'clock in the morning, they fall or something, they report the injury immediately, and there's no reason to believe that whatever they're reporting didn't happen. It could be an injury covered under workers' compensation. We'll talk about some more specific examples as we go along. So there's different things that we need to consider in looking at when an injury at home is covered by workers' compensation. We want to look at the relationship to work. Were they working at the time, and did their injury occur while they were working? The location within the home, is it where they would expect it to be? In Arizona, we've adopted something called the personal comfort rule. And what that means is if you're injured during the course of working, pursuing a personal comfort, that could be covered under workers' compensation as long as it's reasonable and foreseeable. And we will talk about some examples for that. So if you're going to take if you're working at home and you take a short break to get a cup of coffee or get a snack or take a restroom break, it's very likely that if you're injured in pursuing those personal comforts, and if what you're doing is reasonable and foreseeable, that will be covered under workers' compensation. A lunch break might be a little different. It depends on the policy that you have with an employee. Are they expected to take an extended lunch break? Are they off the clock during a lunch break? So there could be some question during a lunch break if an employee is injured. If they just grab a sandwich and they're just working from their desk, then it probably would be covered if they had an injury, if they're not technically off the clock. If an employee runs a personal errand, then there should be question as to whether they have abandoned their employment. So just as an example, I'm working at my desk, I get up to get myself a cup of coffee, I look in my refrigerator and I'm out of creamer. And I decide I'm going to take a quick break and run to the grocery store and get some creamer and pick up a few more items, and I'm injured while going to the grocery store. It's likely at that point that I've abandoned my employment, and that would not be covered under workers' compensation. Likewise, if I take a break during the day to drop kids off at school or pick up kids or run them to activities, I've probably abandoned my employment during those personal errands, and that would not be covered by workers' compensation. We don't really have any cases on point in Arizona on telecommuting at this time. We do have some cases in other jurisdictions. Here's just a couple of examples that I pulled for you, one in Pennsylvania and one in Minnesota. And both of these cases were found to be compensable workers' compensation injuries. One where an employee was walking down a flight of stairs to a home office, and another one where an employee was walking down a flight of stairs from a home office to a kitchen. And both of these were found to be compensable when the employee tripped and fell down the stairs and had some pretty significant injuries. So let's just think of some other examples. Let's say you are working at your desk and you get up for a break and you trip and fall over your dog. Is that going to be covered? Well, again, I think it's reasonable and foreseeable to realize that people have pets within their home, and that's certainly something that can happen, right? You can trip over your pet. It's probably reasonable and foreseeable that that can happen. Another example is, let's say that you have children in the home and one of your children comes in to your work area and knocks over a glass and the glass breaks and you go to pick up the glass and you cut your hand. Well, it's probably reasonable and foreseeable that people are going to have young children at home, and so it's probably going to be covered under workers' compensation. You have to remember it's a no-fault system, and those kinds of things are the kinds of things that can happen while you're working at home. An interesting thing to consider is the going and coming rule. So the going and coming rule is if I leave my home and I drive to the traditional work site in my vehicle, and I'm injured in a motor vehicle accident or somehow injured in my travel to my traditional work site, that is not covered by workers' compensation. There are exceptions to the coming and going rule, and those exceptions can be things like my employer is paying for mileage, or I'm in a vehicle provided by my employer. Another exception can be if I travel from one work site to another work site. And there are some jurisdictions that have said that when you are a telecommuter employee, that your home becomes a work site. And so travel from your home to the traditional workspace can be covered by workers' compensation. Arizona has not addressed that issue yet, but it is something that to consider going forward. So the burden of proof is on an injured employee to prove that their injury is work-related. So it is definitely a challenge to employers when you have employees who are working from home, you're not there. So it's so important to have good communication going with your employees and that you have a trustful relationship with your employees. But if you have a situation where you doubt the injury, an example would be, let's say you get a report of an injury from an employee and they say, hey, you know, I was moving a box of files in my home office and I tweaked my back. And then you get medical records that don't say anything about that. The medical records have some kind of different history in there, so the claim is denied. The employee always has the right to protest that denial and request a hearing with an administrative law judge at the Industrial Commission. So what do you do if there is a work-reported injury? You would conduct a prompt investigation as you would in the traditional work site. How did it happen? When did it happen? Where did it happen? Were there any witnesses to the injury? Was medical care required? And of course, as with any injury, you would notify your workers' compensation carrier immediately so that they can conduct their own investigation. All right. Bobbie is going to talk to us about best practices, and again, we'll address questions for you at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. As Jean was saying, telework, your space at home is a lot like the office. It's very similar, and so you have to think of it as working just like you were in the office, or very similar to it. Employers now are looking to have their employees work at home to keep them safe because of COVID. Also, it helps boost morale and productivity. A lot of workers are reporting they're more productive at home than they were. And so employers are also sometimes thinking, well, maybe we'll extend telework on an indefinite basis even after COVID. So there's a lot of things to think about as an employer in this world. You can next slide, please. Thank you. First of all, a very good thing to have as an employer is a telecommuting policy. And what that'll do for you is to set the guidelines around how you want your employees to behave and how they work with other people in the company and how they work with their supervisor. The very first thing would be to set working hours, because your supervisor and the employee need to know, what are the hours am I supposed to work? Do I work earlier now since I don't have to commute? Do I work later? What's expected of me? And so defining that is important in the policy, and then also just in communication with the supervisor. And then the other reason why work hours are so crucial is because of the Fair Labor Standards Act. I'm sure you've heard of that. That is the wage and hour law. And as we talk about some of the employment laws that are going to apply to your workplace, even at home, all employment laws which apply to the office apply at home. So that might be surprising, but they're equally applicable. So with regard to work hours, you need to keep paying minimum wage, and I think everyone knows that, but overtime is the key issue here. If you have a non-exempt employee, that employee has to be paid overtime if they work over 40 hours in a week under the federal law and in Arizona, and in California, it's a different standard. We'll talk about that in a little bit too and give you some more information. The other thing to do in a policy is setting up how you want the home office to look. And as Jean talked about, you can have a workplace injury at home while you're telecommuting. So you want to be mindful of those ergonomic setups. Make sure everything is aligned. Probably have your employees watch a video or talk to somebody who's knowledgeable in ergonomics so that they can have their setup so there's no injuries like carpal tunnel or back issues. All kinds of things can happen. Regular check-in and reporting, again, that helps with work hours, because what you don't want is unreported overtime. You want to know what hours your employees are working and make sure you pay them for that. Is this a temporary or permanent situation in telecommuting? Like I mentioned, a lot of employers aren't sure right now. Maybe they might want to extend it. But if you're not sure, the best thing to do is to make it temporary until you decide it's permanent. And then the rules might change, and you might want to buy more equipment if it's going to be a long-term situation for your employee. And if an end date is applicable, make sure your employee knows it and it's agreed upon. And at-will employment should be in your policy as well. And what that does is tells your employee that all the same rules apply. All the company policies that applied at work apply at home, and including at will, which means you can be terminated for any reason or you can quit for any reason. And then the policies such as confidentiality, you'll want to remind your employees that the work that you do and your trade secrets and things going on at work isn't to be shared with anybody else. It's just like at work. Things need to be kept confidential. And code of conduct that involves ethics that you want your employees to adhere to. And next slide. So we talked a little bit about the work hours, and one thing that comes up is parent flexibility with regard to COVID-19, because as we know, schools are struggling with how to open. Do they open 1 day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week, full-time, or is it full-time remote? And parents have the obligation to help their kids along with remote schooling. So employers need to be flexible with regard to that. And the reason is you want to keep your employees happy, motivated, productive. And in a lot of jobs, it might not matter what the actual hours are as long as they do the hours and work their job. Especially for exempt employees, it really doesn't matter. For non-exempt, like I mentioned, you do need to track the hours worked so that you're paid appropriately. But flexibility is key in maintaining your employee, retaining them and keeping them happy. The CDC has identified high-risk persons under COVID-19. You've probably seen those guidelines and that definition. And what comes up with regard to employees is that people in those categories don't want to return to work. They want to continue to telecommute even when the office opens sometimes. And that is something that you would want to consider as an employer. Now, it's important to note that as an employer, you can't require your high-risk employees to stay home, but you can accommodate them and allow them to stay home. But to require them to stay home because they fall in one of those categories is probably illegal under the employment laws. Some things to note with regard to flexibility is the ADA. So remember I mentioned that all the employment laws that applied at work apply at home, and that includes Americans with Disabilities Act. And under that act, if someone has a disability, you are required to engage in what's called the interactive process. And that is just a back and forth discussion about how you can help somebody do their job. And I have a definition of reasonable accommodation there so you can see what that is. It's really just a change to the work environment to help someone do their job, to be able to perform all the essential functions. So that could be in a normal situation. It might be telecommuting. That is one accommodation, but it could be other things. I mean, it could be standing more frequently or sitting more frequently at a job and those kind of things. It's a lot easier to accommodate in most cases when someone is teleworking, but it's important to note that those are the things that apply at home as well. So if somebody already has an accommodation with you, those continue to apply when they're at home. I have on this slide an EEOC guidance, which is really helpful if you're trying to work through some of those things. What do you do about high risk people and what they are asking for, if they're asking for a different accommodation, and what about COVID-19? So there's a link there for you, and there's a lot of guidance on the EEOC's website with regard to that. Another thing to consider is having an accurate job description. And the reason for that is that you want to list the essential functions of the job, because if somebody's asking for an accommodation, they need to keep doing the essential functions of the job, but they don't have to do all of the other extraneous things of the job. So you'll want to know what are those key functions that they're required to do, even if you give them an accommodation. That's why all that is very crucial. We talked a little bit already about the Fair Labor Standards Act, and that comes up a lot in telecommuting for non-exempt employees, because like I said, you have to make sure you're paying them accurately, that they're recording their hours, and that definitely they're paying overtime. You're paying overtime, and that they don't work off the clock. In other words, they're reporting their hours. You don't want an employee doing you a favor by offering to work off the clock hours, because that just makes you violate the law. So it's really not a favor. So make sure that that's not allowed for your employees, and you can even discipline for that. I mentioned a little bit earlier about California requirements. It's a lot easier in Arizona, where after 40 hours you have to pay overtime, but in California you have to pay 1.5 times the rate as overtime, anything in excess of 8 hours a day. So if you go over 8 hours, that triggers overtime, 8 to 12. And then after 12 hours, it's double time. So there's a lot of differences. And some other states have different requirements as well. So be aware of that. California also has break requirements and meal requirements. So calculating and documenting when an employee takes their breaks and when they take their meal time is very important for pay for non-exempts. We talked a little bit about ergonomic training on how to prevent work injuries. As Jean mentioned, much of what you do at home can cause an injury. I mean, even, accidents always happen. So making sure your space is clear, you have the right equipment, and employers need to be cognizant and be thoughtful about equipment that they provide to avoid injuries, because you're going to be liable for a lot of injuries that happen at home, it seems like. And then we talked a little bit about other policies applying. Confidentiality is one of the key ones, but training your employees when they're at home to avoid those cyber scams that pop up, and to click on the links and provide your credentials that provide access to your employer's systems, that is crucial. So be vigilant about your training on that while at home as well. And then virtual manners is another thing I just wanted to mention. I know CopperPoint had a blog on that recently, and I know I learned a few things on how to have meetings on Skype or Zoom, and how to just be more cognizant of your manners. For example, with Skype, they suggested that you type in your first sentence, "Do you have time to talk?" That kind of thing. Instead of just popping in with a question that you need answered immediately. It's more considerate to ask, are you okay to talk right now? Something like that. And also eye contact. It's interesting because you don't think about, when you're looking away at a different screen, that the person you're talking to might think you're not paying attention. So I know eye contact is crucial. And then sometimes you have access to those emojis, which everybody advised you use very carefully, because they can be misinterpreted. So either avoid them or just use them carefully. And then respect time, of course, which we're trying to do here. And I know we're getting close to the end of our time, but do the same when you're having a Zoom call. Make sure that you're ending on time, just to have manners and respect people's time. And I think that is all we have for our presentation. I think we can take some questions.
All right, thank you for your questions. We have a, feel free to put any additional questions that you have in here. I'll go through the, some questions that we have. Yes, the presentation that we have today will be provided on our website, and you're welcome to have people go to the website to see the presentation. It is a recording. I'm not sure if the slides will be available. Adrienne, do you know the answer to that question?
I am collecting information from folks interested in accessing the slides, and then we'll get back to them after the presentation.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I think we've answered many of the questions that have been asked already. For instance, are injuries in the workplace at home when it's caused by ergonomic issues? Yes, you can have, Bobbie did a good job of addressing how important it is to have the home offices set up so that they're ergonomically correct if at all possible. Let's see. This is an interesting question. What if you have set hours for an hourly person and that person works during non-approved overtime and is injured during that time? How is that different from a salaried person who has set hours and is injured while working outside set hours? Well, I'm not sure, Bobbie, if you have an answer to that. I would say from a just workers' compensation perspective, if you need to really have that really well in your policy that they're only should be working during the hours that they're working with no overtime. And obviously that's something you cannot control completely when someone's in the workplace. But I would say that if they are injured while working, they still could potentially have a valid workers' compensation claim, even if they're working when they're not supposed to. Bobbie,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if you're working when you're not supposed to, one thing that you can do as an employer is, discipline for that if that's against your policy. And it's a good idea to have no off the clock working and no unauthorized overtime in a policy, and that way it allows you to enforce that, because you're going to have to pay them for their work regardless of whether it's authorized or not. So you do have to pay for non-exempt overtime.
All right. There's a lot of questions in here about the work environment. Would you recommend that we ask employees to have a good desk chair, etc.? Certainly, I think if that is reasonable to try to or at least educate your employees of the need to have a good, safe and environment to do their work in.
One thing to note there too is that in most cases and in most states, the employer is not required to pay for equipment, but it's something that employers should be thoughtful about, because if you want them to avoid a back injury, for example, or carpal tunnel type injuries, you might want to provide some equipment, but you're not required to. But if you do require your employee to have their own equipment, they have to make sure, you need to make sure that their pay doesn't fall below the minimum wage with the costs of their equipment. Like, for example, if they have to pay for their own internet and they're getting minimum wage, you would have to think about whether the costs of providing that equipment makes them fall below minimum wage. So that's a danger there.
One question is, will CopperPoint be coming out with formal telecommuter policy and trainings? I think that's probably more an area that should be addressed by your employment lawyer or employment firm. Would you agree with that, Bobbie?
Yeah, you can definitely talk to your lawyer about it, but there's some other resources that might help you look at sample policies and consider what you might want to have for your own workplace. So for example, SHRM, Society of Human Resources Management, is a group and a website that has a lot of information out there that might help you with sample policies.
There's several questions in here about rates, and unfortunately, Bobbie and I really are not experts in that area. I'm sure if you contact your carrier for those kinds of questions, you can get answers. How telecommuting employees affects your rates for workers' compensation. We don't really know the answer to that one. I apologize. There's a question, is each manager director expected to set their own policy? I'm not really sure what you mean by that. I would expect that you would have a company-wide policy. Would you agree with that, Bobbie?
Yeah, that's definitely the best solution. And part of the reason is so that you're consistent. You want to treat your employees fairly and consistently. In employment law, a lot of ways employees can make claims by showing they weren't treated fairly or the same as somebody else. So consistency is key.
Another question is, for exempt employees, are working hours each day required to be identified? For example, 8 to 5.
So for exempt, no. If for an exempt employee, you're paid to do the job, not paid to work certain hours. So there's a lot of rules that go with that, or a lot of absence of rules also. So one thing that you might want to have work hours so that you know when someone's available. So you need to get a hold of somebody, you know the work hours that they will be answering you, or that kind of thing, just business need. But it's a good idea generally, so coworkers know and the supervisor knows and everybody's on the same page. But you don't have to have set hours if you didn't want to.
How can the employer make sure that the employee has the proper equipment for the home office when they are unable to physically assess the environment?
Yep. That's a good question. I know that there are ways to do it. You can Skype or Zoom with somebody who's knowledgeable about that, and they can take a look at your setup. You can have an employee watch a video on ergonomics and have them set it up themselves. Unfortunately, you're going to have to rely on the employee to help to work with you to figure that out, because there's just no other answer to that. As an employer, if you want to provide some equipment to help with that, that's an ideal situation, because that will, I think, definitely reduce any work comp injuries that you would have.
Adrian, do you know if this is a CEU valid webinar? That's one of the questions.
I am not familiar with that term, Jean. And I am looking at the time and realizing we're right at our 10:30. So I can reach out. I saw that question in the Q&A. I can reach out to that individual with that answer. But if you want to go ahead and wrap it on up, Jean and Bobbie, you've both been awesome. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. We're so happy that everyone was able to join us today. Thank you so much. And a video, once again, will be available on our website for you to access. And also, after the webinar today, we'll be sending out a survey, and any feedback that you can give would be greatly appreciated. And thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.